I know of exactly one thing that supports the concave Earth model, and that is the Tamarack mines anomaly, which is fascinating to me. That experiment.
Actually, I don't really talk about it that much because that's speculative, really. Some people that even talk about that possibly wasn't even conducted.
I read something like a 30-page technical paper.
Have you? Okay.
That. Yes, and it was thoroughly investigated. I mean, they had several universities involved. Major professors who were not like we're not talking about some yahoos dropping a bucket down a mineshaft. We're talking about full professors who were genuinely intrigued. I mean, they even
wasn't there
the weights in like oil, napping and all that kind of stuff. I mean, these guys, they took it seriously.
Wasn't there was a secondary test that was actually conducted in France too, as well, during that time frame, wasn't there?
I'm not aware of the France one.
Okay.
Earth's center of gravity, up or down? Up or down? Why am I even asking you that question? Well, I'm going to read you an article posted on unexplainable.net, which posts the Tamarack Mineshaft Plumb mystery, and why two plumb diverged at bottom of mine shafts, which still today is a mystery and still has been kind of suppressed, that information. There was actually one quote-unquote scientist or physicist that tried to refute the mystery and why they diverged, but his theory or his speculation is based upon a spinning Earth model, and it's also based upon a presupposition that the secondary test that actually was performed in Tamarack, where there were two mine shafts at 4,250 feet apart, never took place, but they did take place. And also it's a question of a true empiricist in not wanting to reconduct that experiment. Just sweep it under the rug, right? Well, truth has a funny way of reemerging, especially when crackpot conventional scientists try to suppress it and get paid to suppress it too. Anyway, I'm going to read you this article. Earth's center of gravity, up or down? Earth's center of gravity. Why was it that at the turn of the century, the Geodetic Survey Department of both the French and United States governments made certain tests which upset the Copernican theory, then decided that they should be kept secret? What actually were these tests, and should they be repeated today under the most severe test conditions? I would think so. I think they really should be repeated today. Don't you think that? If you ever watched a bricklayer at work, you've seen him use a plumb bob to determine the perpendicular so that his wall will be erect and straight. A plumb bob is simply a weight suspended on the end of a cord. It acts on the principle that the attraction of gravity, mass, and weight always points toward the center of gravity, which in the case of the spherical Earth is the exact center. A line formed by the cord of a plumb bob is at precisely a right angle from the horizontal. It is a division of a plane surface into two 90-degree angles by simply laying his bricks parallel to the line of the plumb bob. The bricklayer builds a wall that is precisely erect. If you did not use a plumb bob, there would be many more leaning towers of Pisa in the world. However, the plumb bob is not used only to erect buildings, but is used to measure the distance of the sun, or any planet. This is done by measuring a precise horizontal distance on the Earth, which is naturally a curve, because the Earth is round, and since we know the circumference of the Earth, the distance around it, thus we can calculate an exact base for our proposed triangle to be used in measuring the distance of the sun. Then, by use of a sextant, we can shoot the sun from both ends of this baseline, and get a pair of angles which are slightly less than 90-degree angles because they are obviously not parallel to the perpendicular as determined by the plumb bob. We know that given one side of a triangle and two of its angles, we can calculate the length of the other two sides. Thus, we can tell how far the sun is from the Earth. Yeah, if the Earth were convex, I would suppose that it would probably be about 93 million miles. However, if the Earth is the other way, if it's concave, well, a lot closer, wouldn't it? It isn't quite this simple because we don't know the precise size of the Earth, and thus the difference in parallelness of the two perpendiculars we have achieved at both ends of our baseline. It should be obvious to the reader that since the Plumb Bob's point at the center of the Earth, lines projected to the center of the Earth would meet at that center. Interesting. And likewise, line projected into space would continually move apart. Well, this is a presuppositional fallacy. Thus, we have a great interest in exactly how far it is to the center of the Earth in order to be absolutely sure of our two important angles in figuring planetary distances. Sometime prior to 1901, the French government, wishing to determine more accurately the actual size of the Earth so that they could revise and refine the calculations regarding the distance to the Sun, hit on a way to measure the difference in distance apart at the top of two lines perpendicular to the surface of the Earth and the bottom of these same two lines. So they're just measuring the top versus the bottom of two lines, okay? They wanted a pair of lines long enough to give them an appreciable measurement. Obviously, they could not direct two parallel poles a mile high, but they did feel they could suspend two plumb bobs a mile deep into a mine shaft, and thus be able to measure the distance apart at the top and the distance apart at the bottom, which would be slightly less. Really? Are you sure about that? At the bottom. They wanted to know exactly how much less. The result of these tests were very strange. So strange that the French geodetic scientists contacted the scientists of the American Geodetic Survey and conveyed their results to them, with the request that similar tests be conducted in this country. Officially, nothing was done for some years, but in 1901, one of the geodetic surveyors happened to be working in the vicinity of Tamarack mines near Calumet, Michigan. He contacted the chief engineer at Tamarack and informed him of the information transmitted by the French government. Two mine shafts were selected, and plumb lines exactly 4,250 feet long were suspended in each mine. At the end of these lines, a 60-pound bob was hung in order to prevent movement through a horizontal direction. Each bob was suspended in a tank of oil placed at the bottom of the mine shafts. In this way, it was reasoned magnetic forces could not affect them. The lines used to suspend the bobs were number 24 piano wires. For 24 hours, the lines were allowed to hang so that there would be no possibility of movement from putting them in place, still remaining in the lines. The measurements were begun. It was then that it was discovered that the French geodetic engineers had not made a mistake. Careful rechecking proved that the lines, contrary to expectations, were farther apart at the bottom than they were at the top. There can only be one implication to such a strange result. The center of gravity is not, as previously believed, at the center of the Earth. Well, it is at the center of the Earth if you invert your Earth. But in fact, it must be above the surface of the Earth, somewhere in space. If these two lines, formed by the suspended plumb lines, were to be extended upward, they would meet somewhere in the void away from the Earth. At that point, by all the rules of gravitational attraction, should be the center of gravity to this planet. It's not a planet. Greatly puzzled and not a little disturbed, the Tamarack engineers sent for Professor McNair of the Michigan College of Mines. With McNair there to check his results, the experiment was repeated, the measurements gone over again, and both men were convinced no error had been made. Professor McNair suggested that the plumb bobs be changed to a non-magnetic metal to overcome any possibility of magnetic attraction or repulsion due to a magnetic ore body nearby. But this was done. The same figures were arrived at. If magnetic influences had been at work, they would have varied with different metals, but they did not. Now, suggested McNair, it would be a good idea to prevent air currents from traveling up and down the mine shafts, which might be affecting the plumb lines. Thus, both mine shafts were sealed at the top. Once more, the figures remained the same. After trying many methods to vary the figures and failing, Professor McNair gave up in complete bewilderment. These series of tests had not gone on in complete secrecy, and it was inevitable that the news of them leaked out. It leaked to a reporter of the Milwaukee, Wisconsin Sentinel who published the story. It stated the crux of the situation. The wires were supposed to hang parallel to each other. The reporter made an error here. They should have hung closer together at the bottom. in a presuppositional convex Copernican Earth theory, which is utter bullshit, but were farther apart below the surface than they were at the surface, and they were farther apart below the surface than they were at the surface, and no one had suggested anything that seems to cover the question. Professor McNair, when questioned, stated for publication that he had proved that magnetic attraction from the Earth or the sides of the shaft did not cause a strange divergence. Then he went back to the Michigan College of Mines and wiped the whole thing from his mind. Apparently, this is true, for he made no effort to contact his colleagues or scientists to call attention to the fact that what they were teaching about gravitation and Plumb lines did not actually hold true when put to a conclusive field test. Maybe he was silenced? Is that a possibility? However, we can forgive Professor McNair for his reluctance to pursue the matter further because its implications are tremendous. Indeed, they are totally shattering to our concept of the universe, and in fact, if they can be made to hold true, make a shambles of all our physical sciences. Obviously, Professor McNair was unwilling to so upset his daily routine, or maybe he was paid off or bribed or silenced, nor were the United States and French governments. For as the French put it, the value of the franc will remain unchanged, and bridges and buildings can still be built. So why make an issue of it? Professor Halleck of Columbia University was of a different mind. He heard of the experiment through a professor at the Michigan College. He held that this actually was attraction upon the Plumb lines, and in a very astute article told how easily the matter could be settled by using phosphor bronze wires instead of piano wires and lead bobs instead of iron bobs. The Tamarack engineer, delighted to clear his mind of its confusion, followed these instructions to the letter and came up at precisely the same measurement as before. When Professor Halleck was informed of this result, he retired into a dignified and stony silence. Defeated. Not so the Tamarack engineer. He had decided that something was causing this phenomena, and he was going to find out what it was. Plumb bobs suspended in a single mine gave too delicate a difference in measurement, and after all, were not accurate enough to give any reliable figures on the amount of deviation. For instance, per mile, and whether or not the deviation had any relation to the size of the Earth. After all, it had originally been the purpose of the French Geodetic Survey to refine the actual size of the Earth as then known, late 1800s, to a more accurate figure. They had something in mind concerning artillery and as well as astronomy. So this guy, Professor Halleck, determined to create 2 mine shafts. A second series of experiments were conducted at Calumet, Michigan. This time 2 elevator shafts into the mines were used instead of 1. Now this is important because Donald Simonek's refutation of the Tamarack mine shafts, he's claiming that the 2 separate mine shafts experiment was never conducted. And if it wasn't conducted, first I have to question his integrity as an empirical scientist as to why not to reconduct the experiment. But in lieu of that, or instead of that, or regardless of that, he's basing his deviation based upon a proposed centrifugal force created by a spinning Earth, and however you can't account for that deviation with farther apart mine shafts. So his debunking totally falls through the window. These 2 were 4,250 feet apart and were also 4,250 feet deep. They were connected at the bottom by a perfectly straight transverse tunnel. Now, plumb bobs were hung in each shaft and measurements were made. This time it was found that the plumb lines were 8.22 inches farther apart at the bottom of the pit than at the top. It did not take the Tamarack engineer long to discover that this figure exactly represents the divergence that would be necessary to complete a 360-degree spherical circumference. In other words, a shell of force around the Earth. There was only one difficulty as expressed by the plumb lines. It would be the circumference of the inside of a sphere, and not the outside. Further, the center of gravity, as expressed by the angles formed by the plumb lines, would be approximately 4,000 miles out into space, or actually out, no, 4,000 miles into space, just that, into space, because space is inside the Earth. Obviously, this could not be true, because if the Chinese were to make calculations based on a similar pair of mine shafts in their country, on the opposite side of the globe, the center of gravity would be found to be 4,000 miles in the other direction. The center of gravity, according to the plumb lines, was a sphere circumference, some 16,000 miles in diameter. See, this is still under the faulty presupposition that the Earth is convex. Any place 4,000 miles up was the center of gravity. That's ridiculous. There's only one point of gravity. The center of gravity is still the center of the Earth. However, it's inside the Earth. 4,000 miles. Inside. We are in the Earth. Okay, can we blame the Tamarack engineer for going down in his mine and maintaining a grim silence from that moment on? A United States Geodetic Survey crew for 2 years conducted further experiments, among them measuring the surface of a long lake in Florida on the theory that water conforms to the true curvature of the Earth, of the Earth's surface. That's true, regardless of how the land may be, thus giving a true level, only to find that water curved uphill in each direction rather than downhill. Now you may think, if you look at a horizon, you see a boat in the distance and the boat is clipped at the bottom, and you think, oh, there, the Earth is convex, is spinning. No, actually that's not true. The water is rising due to an optical illusion caused by an inferior mirage. That's all it is, because when you look at that boat through a telescope, the whole boat appears. Debunked. So, see, this true factual formation, curvature of the Earth's surface has been suppressed by idiots, modern scientific conventional man, because they don't believe in an existence of a true God with a true literal center to the Earth. So, this is Donald Simonite, by the way. I talked to this guy back in emails exchanges back in 2003. He's the guy who wrote that, tried to debunk the Tamarack Mineshaft article and also the Cyrus T rectilinear experiments. And he is, I would consider him the crackpot. He is the crackpot jackass. Congratulations, Donald Simonite. You are a jackass. Put a dunce cap on you. You know what you're doing.